The first time America saw Don Garlits' Dragster explode at Lyons Drag Strip in 1970, half the crowd thought they were witnessing a man die in slow motion, and the other half thought they were watching history being rewritten right in front of their eyes. Flames shot into the sky, black smoke billowed like a war zone, and the smell of burning fuel and shredded tires stung the nostrils of everyone within 100 yards. Garlits, Big Daddy himself, had been pushing the boundaries of top fuel drag racing for years, but nothing could have prepared anyone for what happened that day. He wasn't just racing against the clock, he was racing against mortality, and the moment the engine exploded under his car, that race seemed lost. One instant, the car was a sleek, aluminum beast, poised for quarter-mile domination. The next, it was a flaming wreck, hurtling down the strip with Don trapped behind the wheel, his helmet and fireproof suit barely holding against the inferno. The roar of the crowd turned into gasps, screams, and a silence that only tragedy can command. And yet, amid the chaos, the legend of Don Garlits didn't die, it evolved. He survived what no man in drag racing had survived before. And that survival would not just change his career, it would change the sport forever. Because when the NHRA examined the twisted remains of his front-engine slingshot that day, they saw more than wreckage. They saw the necessity for a revolution, a redesign that would turn drag racing on its head and spark the birth of a new era, the rear-engine dragster. And as medics pulled Garlits from the flames, bruised, scorched, and alive, he made a decision in that hospital bed that would define the rest of his career. He would come back faster, smarter, and more unstoppable than ever before. That day wasn't just an accident. It was the beginning of a story that would be told for decades. A story of innovation born from catastrophe, of courage that bordered on madness, and of a racer who refused to let fire and metal dictate the limits of what was possible on the drag strip. From the ashes of his destroyed slingshot, a new vision of speed would rise, and every racer, every fan, and every engineer who followed would feel the tremors of what Don Garlits was about to unleash. In the months leading up to that fateful day in 1970, Don Garlits was already a man obsessed with speed, precision, and the relentless pursuit of breaking barriers. He had spent years perfecting his front-engine slingshot dragsters, machines that were brutal in their power and uncompromising in their demands on both driver and chassis. Each run down the quarter mile was a negotiation with physics itself, and Don had learned to listen to every vibration, every hiss of the fuel lines, every shudder of the tires gripping asphalt. But the truth was, the front-engine design, which had dominated drag racing since the early 1960 seconds, carried inherent risks that no amount of experience could fully mitigate. The driver sat behind a massive, supercharged engine, perched on a narrow chassis that could twist, flex, and fail under the immense forces of nitromethane combustion. And Don had felt that danger every time he launched. The adrenaline rush mixed with a quiet understanding that one tiny mistake could turn the quarter mile into a death sentence. Yet, he had always trusted his instincts, his engineering intuition, and the countless hours spent with his crew fine-tuning every bolt, bracket, and clutch. But that spring day at Lyons Drag Strip, everything that could go wrong did. As Don launched his slingshot, the supercharged engine, pushed beyond its limits by years of evolution and experimentation, erupted in a fury of fire and shrapnel. The car leapt violently off the line, then disintegrated in a flash of metal and fuel, leaving flames licking the sky and rubber screaming across the asphalt. The crowd froze, watching the spectacle in horror, but Don, strapped into the cockpit, demonstrated a presence of mind that bordered on the supernatural. He fought to control the twisted chassis, managing to keep it from cartwheeling uncontrollably, even as pieces of the car shredded around him. When the smoke cleared, medics and officials approached, expecting the worst, only to find Don barely conscious, scorched but alive, a man who had stared into the fire and survived. That survival wasn't luck. It was the culmination of years of experience, calculated risk, and an unbreakable will. And while the NHRA and fellow drivers shook their heads in disbelief, Don's mind was already racing ahead, imagining a way to prevent this from ever happening again. That accident, catastrophic as it was, became the catalyst for what would be known as the rear engine revolution. Don realized that the only way to truly tame the violence of top fuel drag racing was to remove the driver from the direct path of the engine's fury. The front engine slingshot, for all its glory, had reached its limit. A new design, one that placed the engine behind the driver, promised safety, control, and the potential to harness even more speed. And so, from the wreckage and the pain of that day, Don Garlits began drawing, calculating, and imagining a dragster that would not just survive nitro, but thrive, forever changing the sport in ways that would be felt from coast to coast. The world had thought it had seen the limits of speed, but Don knew the fire had only just lit the path forward, and the next chapter of drag racing history was about to be written. The aftermath of that explosion at Lyons Drag Strip was like a storm sweeping through the world of drag racing, leaving everyone unsettled, shaken, and yet strangely electrified. Don Garlits, the man who had just stared death in the face and lived, was no longer just a driver. He had become a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and unflinching courage. The front engine slingshot that had carried him to victory after victory lay twisted in the pits, mangled metal and scorched tires, serving as a stark reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. Photographers captured the wreck in stark black and white images. The headers twisted like broken wings, the rear axle twisted, flames still licking the edges of the chassis, and every magazine and local newspaper splashed with the story of a man who should have died but hadn't. And while the world focused on the catastrophe, Don's mind was already far beyond the mangled remains of his car. He could still feel the vibrations of the engine moments before the explosion, the subtle warping of the chassis under immense stress, the exact instant the supercharger failed and tore itself apart. That instant became an obsession. It wasn't enough to survive. He needed to understand, to analyze, to prevent such a disaster from ever happening again. He spent hours back in his garage, poring over diagrams, clutching pieces of scorched aluminum and charred tubing, imagining how he could design a dragster where the driver wasn't sitting in a tinderbox perched directly behind the engine. The solution, he realized, was radical, almost heretical, in the drag racing world of 1970, and it required every ounce of engineering skill he had acquired over years of tinkering with chassis, clutches, and fuel delivery. Don began sketching the concept of a rear engine dragster, placing the engine behind the cockpit, moving weight distribution, and adjusting center of gravity in ways that most drivers and builders had never dared to consider. His calculations were meticulous. Every mounting point, every torque specification, every measure of wheelbase was considered, tested in his mind over and over. He consulted a handful of trusted mechanics, men who had been with him through every triumph and disaster, explaining that this wasn't just a new car, it was a survival machine. Some of them were skeptical, even fearful. Drag racing was still dominated by the front engine slingshot. Tradition, habit, and pride were all stacked against the idea of placing the engine behind the driver. But Don's certainty was infectious. He wasn't asking them to believe in theory. He was asking them to believe in the necessity of innovation, in the inevitability of progress, and in the raw human will to survive and conquer speed that was otherwise uncontrollable. While he worked, the story of his crash spread through the pits and garages like wildfire. Drivers whispered about the sheer ferocity of the explosion, about how Don had managed to stay conscious long enough to prevent the car from completely flipping, about how he walked away from fire and twisted steel as if he had cheated death itself. Fans lined the fences of every track he visited, asking questions, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had stared the flames down and refused to bow. Magazines dubbed him Big Daddy, a name that seemed to capture both his personality and the weight of the legend he was quickly becoming. But Don wasn't content with legend. He was driven by the raw, primal urge to push boundaries. Every day he sketched, welded, measured, and adjusted. The rear engine design wasn't just about safety, it was about performance, control, and rewriting the record books. He imagined launches that would be smoother, faster, and more predictable. He envisioned the elimination of catastrophic blowouts that could end careers or lives. And as he tightened the last bolts and tested the first rear engine prototypes, something remarkable began to happen. The drag racing world started to take notice. Skeptics watched from the sidelines as Don's sketches came to life, as pieces of aluminum and tubing slowly transformed into a shape that looked both alien and inevitable. And every time the new Dragster's engine fired, it screamed a warning to the old guard. The era of the front-engine slingshot was ending. Outlaw racers, mechanics, and fans felt a thrill like nothing else. This wasn't just another car. This was evolution in motion, a mechanical declaration that speed, safety, and audacity could coexist, and that the man who had survived the worst explosion in NHRA history was now leading the charge into a new frontier. By the time Don rolled the first rear-engine dragster to the line, every eye in the pit area and every heart in the stands knew something extraordinary was about to happen. The stage was set, the players were ready, and the legend of Don Garlits was about to enter its most revolutionary chapter yet. The question lingering in every mind was simple. Could the man who had faced fire and survived now redefine speed itself? The answer was about to roar down the quarter mile, and the world would never be the same. The first time the rear-engine dragster fired on the track, the sound was unlike anything anyone had heard before. It wasn't just the raw thunder of a top-fuel engine. It was the sound of defiance, of a man who had stared death in the face and refused to accept the rules of physics, tradition, or convention. Don Garlits climbed into the cockpit, strapped himself in, and felt the familiar tremor of nitromethane coursing through the chassis. Only this time he was no longer perched precariously behind a supercharged engine that could obliterate him in an instant. He was seated ahead of it, in control, commanding the power rather than being enslaved by it. The mechanics cleared the pits, giving him room, their faces a mix of awe and disbelief, while cameras from magazines and local news crews captured every motion, every bolt, every detail. When Don punched the throttle, the rear-engine dragster leapt forward with a smoothness that defied the violent acceleration of the front-engine slingshots. The tires gripped the asphalt with authority, the chassis remained composed, and the fire from the headers was contained yet ferocious. For the first time in years, Garlits felt a sense of partnership with the machine rather than a tenuous struggle to survive it. Spectators along the fences gasped, and the old guard in the pits watched silently, realizing that the balance of power in drag racing was shifting in a way they could neither predict nor prevent. By the time the car crossed the quarter mile, posting times that rivaled the fastest front-engine slingshots ever recorded, a new reality had begun to take hold. The rear-engine design was not just safer, it was faster, more controllable, and capable of pushing limits previously thought impossible. Don stepped out of the cockpit, his suit stained with oil and sweat, and looked back at the machine he had built from fire, fear, and determination. He knew that the NHRA, the racers, and the fans would take time to accept it, that tradition dies slowly even when logic screams for change. But he also knew that he had created something revolutionary. The following week saw Don take the rear-engine dragster to every track he could access, sometimes in unofficial match races, sometimes in exhibition runs, each pass a demonstration of both ingenuity and survival. Competitors tried to follow, many struggling to adapt their own machines, others openly skeptical, claiming that nothing could replace the tried and true front-engine slingshots. Yet every run proved the opposite. Flames, speed, and controlled power were no longer enemies. They were tools, and Don wielded them with precision, turning every pass into a lesson in both bravery and engineering. By the end of the season, the chatter in the pits had shifted from concern for the man who had survived a catastrophic explosion to awe at the man who had transformed danger into opportunity. The rear-engine dragster wasn't just a novelty, it was the future. And Don Garlits, the man who had emerged from fire and metal unbroken, had become the architect of that future, proving that true innovation often rises from the ashes of disaster. As night fell on tracks across the country, the roar of rear-engine dragsters echoed in the distance, a clarion call that change had arrived, that speed would never be the same, and that the legend of Don Garlits was no longer just about surviving, it was about dominating in ways the world had never imagined. The question that hung in the minds of racers and fans alike was clear. How fast, how far, and how high could the man who had conquered fire push the limits of drag racing next? The answer would come screaming down the strip, and nobody would ever forget it. After the first successful runs in his rear-engine dragster, Don Garlits realized he was standing on the edge of a revolution, one that would shake the foundations of drag racing and challenge the conventions that had ruled the sport for decades. The front-engine slingshots, for all their glory and brutality, had dominated for years, but they had always carried a hidden cost: danger. Every driver knew that a single malfunction could launch a car into the air like a rocket, leaving nothing but fire, twisted metal, and shattered bones in its wake. Don's own near-fatal experience had driven the point home harder than any lesson, and now, with the engine behind him, he felt a sense of power and control that was intoxicating. Each run became a test of courage and engineering prowess, a ballet of speed and precision that combined years of experience with the raw instinct of a man who had seen the worst and survived. Word of his rear-engine experiments spread quickly through the pits, first in whispers, then in astonished conversations, and finally in full-blown excitement as fans and fellow racers realized that the old ways of drag racing were changing before their eyes. Even veteran competitors, men who had grown up racing front-engine cars and prided themselves on their toughness, couldn't ignore what Don had accomplished. The smooth launches, the controlled handling, the reduced risk of catastrophic failure, all of it was undeniable proof that the rear-engine layout was the future. But the road to acceptance wasn't simple. Many racers clung stubbornly to tradition, arguing that the new design was unproven, untested, and potentially dangerous in ways they didn't yet understand. Some laughed at the idea of a rear-engine dragster, dismissing it as a novelty, a gimmick for exhibition runs. Others were secretly terrified because they knew that if the rear-engine layout proved faster and safer, their front-engine cars and the reputations built on them would become obsolete almost overnight. Don, however, was undeterred. He refined the design relentlessly, tweaking chassis geometry, suspension, weight distribution, and aerodynamics, working late into nights in his garage. The hum of grinders and welding torches blending with the distant echoes of tires burning on asphalt. He was obsessed, not just with speed, but with control, with perfection, with creating a machine that would not just survive nitromethane, but master it. Every pass down the strip became a demonstration of his philosophy, that courage alone was not enough, that innovation and engineering could amplify bravery and reduce risk, turning near-death experiences into tools for domination. By the end of that season, the reaction from the drag racing world was undeniable. Rear-engine dragsters were no longer a curiosity. They were a force. Other drivers began experimenting, inspired by Don's success, while magazines and newspapers ran photos of the machine blazing down the quarter mile, flames licking the headers, tires gripping the asphalt with surgical precision. Don had not only survived the wildest crash in NHRA history, he had harnessed it, turned it into insight and innovation, and reshaped the sport in his image. And as he looked across the starting line at every competitor daring to face him, the thought that lingered in his mind was simple. The fire had taken everything from him once, but now it had given him everything: speed, control, and a legacy that would echo in every quarter mile to come. The rear engine revolution had begun, and the world of drag racing would never be the same. The months following Don Garlits' debut of the rear-engine dragster were a whirlwind of disbelief, admiration, and mounting tension. Racers who had once laughed at the idea of placing the engine behind the driver now studied every detail, every photograph, every whispered report from the strips where Big Daddy had run. The rear-engine layout wasn't just faster. It was smarter, safer, and more ruthless than anything they had ever seen. Don spent countless hours with his crew, analyzing data from every pass, tweaking the suspension geometry, adjusting tire pressures, and fine-tuning clutch engagement, each modification designed to extract every ounce of performance from the machine while maintaining the safety that had once seemed impossible in Top Fuel. The NHRA officials, initially skeptical, could no longer ignore the revolution unfolding before their eyes. They watched as times dropped, as launches became smoother, and as the engine's fury was harnessed in a way that made front-engine slingshots look archaic by comparison. Word spread quickly, and soon, every major Top Fuel team was experimenting with rear-engine designs, trying desperately to catch up to Garlits' innovation. Yet Don remained several steps ahead, constantly testing new ideas, exploring weight distribution, adjusting wheelbase lengths, and perfecting the placement of every component to maximize traction and control. Fans flocked to every race, eager to witness the audacity of the man who had survived the worst crash in NHRA history and come back not just unbroken, but unbeatable. The roar of the rear-engine dragster became a signature sound, echoing across tracks and leaving audiences in awe, their excitement tinged with a visceral fear of the raw power unleashed on the quarter mile. Mechanics, engineers, and rival drivers alike marveled at the control Don exhibited, how he could launch at full throttle without the car twisting, how he could modulate the clutch and keep the chassis stable even under the immense torque of nitromethane-fueled explosions. The old guard of drag racing realized that the sport was entering a new era, one in which bravery alone would not be enough. To compete, to survive, racers had to embrace innovation or risk being left behind. And while Don's rear-engine dragster dominated, there were still challenges, moments of doubt, and technical setbacks. The engines, after all, were still violent beasts capable of destruction, and each run carried the latent threat of fire, blowouts, or mechanical failure. Yet Garlits' meticulous attention to detail, combined with his instinctive feel for the machine, allowed him to harness that power, turning potential catastrophe into spectacular triumph. By the end of the year, the rear-engine revolution had gained unstoppable momentum. Other drivers adopted the design, the NHRA quietly acknowledged its superiority, and Don Garlits cemented his place not just as a champion, but as an innovator who had reshaped the sport through courage, ingenuity, and an unrelenting refusal to accept limits. The legend of the man who survived fire, twisted metal, and near-certain death grew with each passing quarter mile, and the roar of his dragster became a clarion call to racers everywhere. The future had arrived, and it carried the engine behind the driver. As the sun set over tracks across the country, flames from rear-engine exhausts illuminated the night, a vivid reminder that speed, danger, and innovation were inseparable, and that Don Garlits had changed drag racing forever. The question on every competitor's mind was clear: who would rise to meet him, and who would be left in the shadows of a revolution they had refused to see coming? By 1971, the rear-engine dragster was no longer an experiment or a novelty. It was the standard by which all Top Fuel machines would soon be judged, and Don Garlits stood at the center of a movement he had ignited from the ashes of disaster. The memory of that catastrophic explosion at Lyons drag strip still haunted him. The smell of burning fuel and scorched rubber seared into his mind, a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. But that memory had been transformed from fear into fuel, into the relentless drive to build a machine that could survive and dominate, a car that would rewrite the rules of what was possible on the quarter mile. Every track he visited became a proving ground, every run a demonstration of control, courage, and engineering mastery. Mechanics and engineers marveled at the precision of the rear engine design, at the way the weight distribution allowed for smoother launches, and the elimination of the terrifying wheel stands that had plagued front-engine slingshots. Competitors who had once dismissed the idea were now forced to confront it, to analyze it, to try to emulate it, knowing that failure to adapt could mean falling behind permanently. Don's influence extended beyond the cockpit. He had become a mentor, a teacher, and a symbol of the future, showing that innovation could not be feared, but must be embraced. The media, always hungry for drama and spectacle, chronicled every pass, every victory, and every close call, painting Garlits as a man who had stared death in the face and returned stronger, faster, and smarter. Crowds followed him from Pomona to Lyons to Orange County, eager to see the roar of the rear-engine dragster, the flames that leapt from its headers, and the controlled fury with which it conquered asphalt. And yet, for all the acclaim, Don never lost sight of the lessons of that first explosion. Safety, precision, and respect for the raw power of nitromethane remained at the forefront of every design decision, every bolt tightened, every adjustment made to the clutch or suspension. The rear-engine dragster had proven itself, but it was still a creature of extreme violence and speed, and Don treated it with the reverence of a man who understood what it meant to survive. Rival drivers tried to push back, experimenting with hybrid designs or tweaking front-engine layouts, but the writing was on the wall. The era of the slingshot was ending, and a new generation of drag racers was emerging, trained to respect innovation, to understand the physics of weight distribution, and to appreciate the man who had risked everything to forge a safer, faster path. By the end of the season, Don's dominance was clear, but more importantly, so was his impact. The rear-engine dragster wasn't just a car, it was a philosophy, a revolution born from disaster and perfected through courage, intelligence, and relentless determination. Every time he climbed into the cockpit and launched down the quarter mile, he reminded the world that true legends are not born from victories alone, but from the ability to rise from the flames, to learn from catastrophe, and to redefine the boundaries of possibility. And as the roar of his engine faded into the night, leaving trails of smoke and awe in its wake, one thing was certain: Don Garlits had changed drag racing forever. And the echoes of that 1,970 explosion would fuel a revolution that no one could ever stop. The question on everyone's lips was no longer whether the rear-engine dragster could survive it, was whether anyone would ever match the man who had tamed it. By 1972, the rear-engine dragster had cemented itself as the ultimate evolution of top fuel, and Don Garlits had become the undisputed king of the quarter mile. Every driver who had once doubted the design now studied it obsessively, trying to understand how one man had transformed disaster into dominance, and how a simple relocation of the engine had rewritten the rules of speed and safety. Don's reputation had grown beyond the confines of the track. He was a symbol of courage and ingenuity, a man who had stared the abyss of nitromethane and fire and refused to blink. But the rise of the rear-engine dragster was not without its battles. Engineers and mechanics, eager to push the envelope, began experimenting with ever more powerful engines, larger superchargers, and more aggressive setups, constantly challenging Don to adapt, improve, and innovate. Each pass down the strip became a duel, not just with the clock, but with the limitations of physics itself. Flames roared from the headers, tires screamed as they struggled to grip, and the rear-engine chassis flexed and shifted under the immense forces. Yet Don navigated it with a grace that belied the raw chaos surrounding him. Fans flocked in droves to witness the spectacle, captivated by the combination of danger, precision, and innovation. The roar of the Cammer and other high-horsepower engines had once defined the excitement of drag racing, but now the controlled fury of Garlits' rear-engine machine set a new standard. Photographers captured every moment, from the blur of tires leaving the line to the fire trailing behind, images that would grace the covers of magazines and inspire a generation of young racers and engineers. Across the pits, conversations shifted from skepticism to strategy. Drivers and crew chiefs debated weight distribution, suspension geometry, and clutch tuning, all trying to emulate the control Don had achieved. Yet no one could match the combination of instinct, experience, and meticulous preparation that he brought to every run. And while the rear-engine dragster dominated, it did not eliminate danger. Every run still carried the threat of mechanical failure, tire blowouts, or unpredictable behavior under extreme acceleration. But Don had transformed risk into calculated opportunity. Every vibration, every shudder, every hiss of nitro-fed combustion was interpreted and mastered, turning a potential catastrophe into a breathtaking demonstration of power and precision. By the end of the season, the landscape of drag racing had shifted irreversibly. The rear-engine layout was no longer a radical idea, it was the blueprint for the future. Tracks that had once echoed with the violence of front-engine slingshots now resonated with the controlled, commanding roar of rear-engine machines. And at the heart of it all was Don Garlits, the man who had survived the wildest crash in NHRA history, who had harnessed fire, fear, and metal to forge a new era of speed. As the sun set over tracks from Pomona to Orlando, the silhouette of the rear-engine dragster against the fading light was more than a machine. It was a symbol of resilience, innovation, and the unyielding pursuit of excellence. And every competitor, every fan, and every engineer who had witnessed it knew one undeniable truth. Don Garlits had not just survived history's most violent crash, he had turned it into a revolution that would echo down every quarter mile for decades to come. The question on everyone's mind was no longer if the rear-engine design would last, but how far the man who had tamed it could push the limits of speed, power, and legend. By 1973, the rear-engine dragster had become more than just an innovation. It had become the standard-bearer of top fuel, and Don Garlits had cemented his place as a living legend in American motorsports. Every track he entered, every exhibition or match race drew crowds hungry to witness the controlled chaos he had mastered. Photographers snapped images of the sleek machine launching with flawless precision, flames licking the headers, smoke curling behind the rear tires, and fans held their breath as the car accelerated with terrifying authority. The story of his 1,970 explosion at Lyons drag strip had become part of the lore, a cautionary tale of the dangers that once lurked in front-engine slingshots, and a testament to the ingenuity that had turned near death into triumph. Rival drivers had long abandoned skepticism and were now scrambling to catch up, but no one could replicate the combination of experience, intuition, and relentless experimentation that Don poured into every machine. The pits had transformed into workshops of obsession as crews meticulously studied every aspect of his car: the wheelbase, the suspension geometry, clutch engagement, engine tuning, and weight distribution, seeking the secret to taming the fury that had once threatened to kill him. Yet Don was always one step ahead. Every modification he made, every adjustment to the chassis, was informed by countless passes and a deep understanding of the limits of man and machine. He had learned to read the vibration of the tires, the pressure of the clutch, the sound of the supercharged engine, and the feedback from the asphalt beneath him in ways that bordered on instinctual genius. But the significance of the rear-engine design went beyond speed or safety. It changed the psychology of drag racing itself. Drivers no longer had to gamble with their lives on every run, and yet the challenge remained just as intense. The rear-engine layout demanded precision, timing, and nerves of steel. And those who mastered it gained not only competitive advantage but the respect of an entire sport. Don's influence extended beyond the drag strip. Young racers who had grown up idolizing him began building their own rear-engine machines, inspired by the idea that innovation and courage could coexist. The NHRA, once hesitant and conservative, slowly adapted to the new reality, sanctioning rear-engine entries and recognizing the necessity of evolving rules to match the machines of the future. Meanwhile, Don continued to push the envelope, testing new ideas, refining every detail, and showing the world that surviving an explosion wasn't enough. True greatness required the vision to transform catastrophe into progress. Each time he launched, the roar of the rear-engine dragster echoed not just through the track, but through the collective imagination of American motorsports, a signal that the frontier of speed had been expanded and that the man who had faced fire and survived now commanded it. By the end of the season, it was clear that the front-engine slingshot era was over. Don Garlits had not only survived the wildest crash in NHRA history, he had turned it into a revolution, rewriting the blueprint of drag racing and inspiring a generation to dream bigger, build smarter, and race harder. And as the sun set over tracks across the country, the echo of his engine's roar left a lingering message in the air. Disaster could be overcome, fear could be mastered, and legends, real legends, could be forged in fire, metal, and relentless determination. The question that remained was no longer about survival. It was about how far this man could push speed, and who, if anyone, could ever match him. By 1974, the rear-engine revolution that Don Garlits had sparked in the wake of his 1,970 Lions dragstrip explosion was no longer just a concept. It had become the foundation of modern top-fuel drag racing. The man who had survived what was once thought to be an unsurvivable crash had not only returned to the sport, but had transformed it, turning fear into innovation and danger into dominance. Every run he made was a testament to meticulous engineering, relentless courage, and an unbreakable will to control what had once been uncontrollable. Photographs of his dragster launching with flawless precision, tires gripping the asphalt, and flames trailing from the headers filled magazines and newspapers, inspiring awe in fans and envy in competitors. Don's rear-engine design had forced every driver, every team, and every sanctioning body to reconsider what was possible, proving that safety and speed could coexist without compromising the thrill of the sport. The lessons of that catastrophic 1,970 explosion had permeated every decision. Chassis design, clutch setup, weight distribution, and fuel delivery were all scrutinized, refined, and tested, ensuring that what once had been a machine capable of instantaneous destruction had become a vehicle of precision and power. The old front-engine slingshots, once dominant, now seemed almost archaic, relics of a past era when bravery was measured by the willingness to risk life with every launch. Don Garlits had rewritten that measure, showing that true courage was in vision, preparation, and the willingness to innovate where others feared to tread. Across the pits, in workshops and garages, racers and mechanics studied his design, attempting to replicate the magic, the control, and the raw authority of the rear-engine dragster. But few could match the combination of instinct, experience, and genius that Don brought to every pass. Fans followed his every move, thrilled by the drama, the speed, and the spectacle, witnessing history being made with every launch. And yet, even as records were broken and legends solidified, Don remained humble, aware that the machine was an extension of his mind, his hands, and his courage. He had stared death in the face, survived fire and twisted steel, and emerged not only alive, but as the architect of an entire era in drag racing. The rear-engine revolution had proven that innovation born from catastrophe could create something timeless, a design that would dominate Top Fuel for decades, and a legacy that would inspire racers for generations. Every roar of his engine, every tire that gripped asphalt with calculated fury, Every blazing quarter mile was a reminder that Don Garlits was not just a survivor, he was a pioneer, a visionary, and a man who had turned the most violent crash in NHRA history into the greatest transformation the sport had ever seen. Even years later, the legacy of that 1970 crash and the rear-engine revolution lived on in every corner of the drag racing world. Shops across America were building cars with the same principles Don had pioneered, and young drivers studied his runs frame by frame, trying to learn the rhythm, the feel, the split-second decisions that made him untouchable. Conversations in the pits no longer centered solely on raw horsepower. They turned to balance, control, and the subtle art of keeping the monster of nitromethane in check. Engineers dissected every detail of chassis geometry and weight distribution. Mechanics argued over clutch engagement and tire compounds, and fans debated which track would see the next record-breaking pass. Yet through it all, Don remained more than a competitor. He was the standard, the benchmark of what courage and innovation could achieve when fused together. Every time a rear-engine dragster launched perfectly down the quarter mile, it was a nod to the man who had stared flames in the face and returned not only alive, but transformed into a force that reshaped an entire sport. His story became legend not because of the danger he survived, but because of what he did with that survival. He turned disaster into progress, fear into invention, and risk into mastery. And as night fell on the tracks, with the roar of rear-engine dragsters echoing across the asphalt, fans and racers alike understood that the man who had once been the victim of one of drag racing's wildest crashes had become its greatest architect, a living proof that true legends are forged in fire, resilience, and an unrelenting refusal to accept limits. Every quarter mile that flashed beneath the wheels of a rear-engine machine carried a whisper of Don Garlits' genius, a reminder that history is shaped not only by talent, but by the courage to rebuild after catastrophe, to innovate where others fear, and to leave a legacy that will roar through the ages. If you love this story of Don Garlits and the birth of the rear-engine dragster, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you the most thrilling, true stories from the golden era of American drag racing legends, engines, and moments that shaped the sport forever. Don't miss the next roar down the quarter mile. Join us and witness history in motion.